Thank you for joining us in this series called The Black Education Experience in the United States, Testaments of Courage, Freedom, Resilience, and Dignity. Today's lesson will look at the issue of outlaw education, Black education as resistance to institutional racism. There may be no better way to appreciate the power inherent in a thing than to understand the effort made to keep others from obtaining that thing, whatever it may be. In the case of education in the United States, the African American experience has much to teach us about the power of education as the great equalizer. The African American community is the only group of people in this nation's history to have their education rendered a crime. For more than 200 years, it was against the law to teach an enslaved African how to read, to write, and enslaved Africans were forbidden from educating themselves. This was the law and order of the 1600s all the way through the 1800s, up to the Civil War. Africans enslaved risked their lives to obtain the most rudimentary learning. That history sets the course for any conversation on education and Black people and any related matter, including employment, housing, and health. The first such laws appear in the colony of South Carolina in 1740. Whereas the having of slaves taught to read or write, or suffering them to be employed in writing, may be attended with great inconveniences, be it enacted, that all and every person and persons whatsoever who shall hereafter teach or cause any slave or slaves to be taught to write, or shall use or employ any slave as a scribe in any manner of writing whatsoever, hereafter taught to write, every such person or persons shall, for every such offense, forfeit the sum of 100 pounds, current money. This law would soon be adopted by other colonies, each with increased levels of punishment. Next slide. In Georgia, this act would be integrated into their body of statutes as late as 1829, where it says that if any slave, Negro, or free person of color, or any white person shall teach any other slave, Negro, or free person of color to read or write either written or printed characters, the said free person of color or slave shall be punished by a fine and whipping, or fine or whipping at the discretion of the court. And if a white person so offending, he, she, or they shall be punished with fine, not exceeding $500 and imprisonment in the common jail at the discretion of the court, before whom said offender is tried. What I want you to note here is that even free persons of color were not permitted literacy. Also note that physical punishment was reserved for Africans and free persons of color. The greatest threat was always reserved for Black persons in pursuit of literacy and education. Dr. Carter G. Woodson, in his classic work, The Miseducation of the Negro, published in 1933, best captures the meaning of these laws when he wrote that, quote, "When you control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his actions. You do not have to tell him not to stand here or go yonder. He will find his proper place and will stay in it," end quote. The proper place for Black people as established and affirmed by these laws was slavery. Keeping Africans enslaved away from any learning that would cause them to reflect upon and thus resist their enchained condition, a condition that the system was dependent upon. In very obvious ways, those laws were established to serve as a safeguard against an enslaved person acquiring the means to navigate their way out of the ignorance that slavery necessitated and find their footing on the pathway to freedom. In this respect, no other person better embodies this duality of oppression and liberation and the critical role of education than the one Frederick Douglass, arguably the greatest orator in the history of the United States. Douglass was born into slavery. A little bit of alphabet learning he received was like gasoline to the flame of liberty that burned within him since he was a child. Some men know the value of education by having it, said Douglass. I know its value by not having it. In an address entitled Lecture on Slavery, delivered in Rochester, New York on December 1, 1850, Douglass said the following about education as the enemy of slavery. The first work of slavery is to mar and deface those characteristics of its victims which distinguish people from things and persons from property. It reduces man to a mere machine as the serpent charmer of India is compelled to extract the deadly teeth of his venomous prey before he is able to handle him with impunity. So the slaveholder must strike down the conscience of the slave before he can obtain the mastery over his victim. Nor is slavery more adverse to the conscience than it is to the mind. This is shown by the fact that in every state of the American Union where slavery exists, there are laws absolutely prohibitory of education among the slaves. The great mass of slaveholders look upon education among the slaves as utterly subversive of the slave system. Douglass would go on to say, it is perfectly well understood at the South that to educate a slave is to make him discontented with slavery and to invest him with a power which shall open to him the treasures of freedom. And since the object of the slaveholder is to maintain complete authority over his slave, his constant vigilance is exercised to prevent everything which militates against or endangers the stability of his authority. Education being among the menacing influences and perhaps the most dangerous is, therefore, the most cautiously guarded against. Given this history, African Americans have long understood the value of education. It has been the treasured achievement of knowledge and learning, the means to claim ownership of oneself, and the capacity to chart one's journey to self-actualization, otherwise known as freedom, and community development. Whether in the effort to escape the physical chains of slavery or to achieve a measure of freedom by ways of unlocking the enforced chains of sanctioned illiteracy, Black people carried a thirst for learning that no whip or threat thereof could take from them. As recorded in just about every slave narrative written, African Americans risked their lives to steal an education and share forward whatever learning they acquired with their fellow bondsmen and bondswomen. In a world yet stricken by oppression marked by race, the pursuit of a quality education as a pathway to a better life remains the preferred means for a community for whom education has never been a guarantee. In recent years, some have risked their very freedom to see that their children are able to receive the best education possible, whether using the address of relatives in districts with better schools or using a fake address due to homelessness. We have seen cases of African American parents convicted of larceny, stealing an education for their children. The chains of slavery have been replaced with the structural confines of generational poverty. The laws that today link quality education to property ownership are the living legacy of this history of anti-Black codes and restrictions. This dynamic of oppression is further heightened in light of 2019 bribery and cheating scandal that exposed a generations-long practice of wealthy white families bribing their way into the best colleges in the country. Daniel Golden, senior editor at ProPublica and the author of the book, The Price of Admission, How America's Ruling Class Buys Its Way into Elite Colleges and Who Gets Left Outside the Gates, captured this duality of Black oppression and white privilege these cases brought forth when he stated in a PBS interview, quote, "There is a racial component. The legacy preference for alumni children disproportionately benefits whites. And the proportion of legacy students at elite universities can be anywhere from 10% to 20% of the student body or even higher. And people tend to criticize traditional affirmative action in a vacuum, as if the rest of the system were merit-based, and affirmative action was the only preference that interferes with that. But actually, it's dwarfed by the combined prevalence of these other preferences that favor the rich and the white. The inherent contradictions of this society are evident in its educational system that proclaims itself a meritocracy, yet is erected on the edifice of property value and ownership. We cannot engage in honest conversation of education in the US without first acknowledging the depraved foundation such inequality was founded upon, that legally bound those it deemed 3/5 of a person into 2 centuries of tortured ignorance as safeguard for the material prosperity of those deemed as citizens. A citizenry whose status continues to be maintained by this history. When we talk about legacy students, it is this legacy that should come first to mind. In such a society, any act meant to secure a modicum of education as a means toward a better life must be viewed through the lens of this history to be properly understood and appreciated. Otherwise, you risk reinforcing the very structures of oppression such persons taking such actions are seeking to overcome. Frederick Douglass once said that to deny education to any people is one of the greatest crimes against human nature. It is to deny them the means of freedom and the rightful pursuit of happiness, and to defeat the very end of their being. African Americans in their generation's effort to chart a path to freedom by the compass marked in their pursuit of education has become a road paved by their labors that is now walked by many other communities regardless of the size of their bank accounts or their national origins. It is the testament of the fearlessness of a community whose perseverance in the face of institutional immorality is a light on the path for education as a human right for all people. For those interested, we certainly hope that those of you watching are interested in continuing your education on these topics. Here are a great set of books that I invite you to consider. Self-Taught, African American Education, Slavery and Freedom by Heather Andrea Williams. Of course, as I mentioned often in my presentation, Frederick Douglass himself, the writer and author of his book, My Bondage and My Freedom. When Affirmative Action Was White, An Untold History of Racial Inequality in 20th Century America by Ira Katznelson, and The Price of Admission, as mentioned earlier, How America's Ruling Class Buys Its Way into Elite Colleges by Daniel Golding. And for those who are ready to take the learning on to a whole nother level completely, I invite you to contact racial-justice.org and learn more about the work of Origin. Again, thank you so much for this time.
Hello and welcome back to our series. I am happy to be with all of you today. This is the Privileging Higher Education in the US series, and I am very happy to be here today. As you know, season 1 is focused on the Black educational experience in the United States, and it is truly my honor and privilege to introduce to you Ewario Allende, who is an activist, an advocate, an author, but most of all, to the foundation, Ewario has been someone that we have gone to time and time again to provide advisement on diversity issues and to also educate our students and to strengthen their sense of identity. As you know, we focus on students of color at the Kaplan Educational Foundation. And in this journey, our goal is to really bring students of color to leadership positions by ensuring that they have as many educational opportunities as possible. So that should inform you why it is that we are currently working with Ewario. It's truly an honor to have you. Welcome, and thank you for being with us. Um, we also have Rhoda Tamaklo, a true partner in the Kaplan Educational Foundation. She is the Director of Operations and certainly often the person that I go to really provide the best advice, but also to really strengthen the way that we deliver our services to our students. Again, this is a very important conversation, and this is a conversation and a presentation that I hope you will go back to and share widely. So thank you to everyone. And I introduce you again to Rhoda Tamaklo and Ewario Allende. Welcome.
Thank you, Nancy, for pulling this together. Your leadership in getting this off the ground, and of course, again to Dan, who's behind the scenes making this happen. So, Ewario, this, as you know, hit home for me in many ways, and so I would like to start us off with, particularly the pieces about the legislation. So, how does the establishment of these laws challenge the perception that Black inferiority was inherent during that time period?
Well, certainly. Well, first of all, hi again. Good to see you. Good to see Nancy and good friend Dan working behind the scenes. Yes, so with respect to legislation, what we clearly understand by the development of these laws is fundamentally the first thing, most important thing, that as Frederick Douglass aptly put, every man knows that slavery is wrong for him. And that understanding enables us to appreciate why these laws were put in place. There's so much chatter over the years, over the generations, where folks try to in some way defend but not defend the thinking of, say, white people at this time period, where they say, well, that was just the practice of the time. We have to understand and appreciate slavery was around and, it was socially accepted. To whatever degree that is true, what we must never fail to appreciate is that there was also a clear understanding that for the persons who were enslaved, there was never a consensus among them that they desired to be enslaved. And the white population, understanding that, went out of their way to establish laws to assure that those persons would never acquire the knowledge and understanding to be able to sit back and reflect upon their condition enough to realize just how bad a state they were in, and then to actually use their mind, use their mental capacity to figure out a way out of it. And so these laws clearly establish that. Furthermore, what it also states is that in the mindset of the white population that put these laws into place, again, beginning all the way into the 1600s, as late as the 1800s, and these laws would stay in place until the conclusion of the Civil War. They clearly help us to appreciate that even for white folks, they understood that slavery was wrong. And that the only way to assure slavery would stay in place was to keep these folks ignorant, to keep these folks unlettered, to keep these people unable to acquire the education that white people understood upon acquiring would cause these folks to rebel against their state.
This I want to go a little bit further into that, in that piece about law, because there was a part when I was watching this that I literally was like, the piece you're talking about, free persons of color were not permitted to read, because I hear a lot of people talking about my freedom of speech.
Yeah.
But I also hear things like, college isn't for everybody, and is college a luxury? And so I really, if you could just talk a bit more about the fact that you could be a free Black person, but you could be whipped and fined for being able to read. And that was the law. So if you could just clarify and just I want to make sure we understand this part.
So again, what that helps us to appreciate is that with respect to class dynamics in the United States, from its inception to the present day, it is not possible to have an honest conversation about class dynamics, working class issues, middle class issues, capitalism as a system of the economy, without injecting an understanding of race. Here, that plays out very clearly. You have two different classes of Black folks in, say, the 1800s throughout the South. Not every person, certainly the majority, the overwhelming majority of Black people in the South were enslaved, but there were a population of Black folks who were not enslaved. Some, in fact, were born free, such as Martin Delany, who was a partner to Frederick Douglass in the establishment of the North Star, which was a newspaper that both of them were publishers of. Martin Delany was born in Virginia. Martin Delany was born to an enslaved man and a free Black woman. According to the Black codes or the slave codes of that period, if you, the condition of an African American, an African person in the United States, was determined by the condition of the mother. So if the mother was enslaved, the person would be enslaved. If the mother was free, the person would be free. And of course, we can appreciate why that law was put in place. All you got to do is sit back and think about how people are brought onto this planet. What that law enabled was owners of persons to then go and rape the persons they owned and not worry for the condition of those persons, okay? Those persons would be enslaved. They would actually then be selling their own children into slavery is what it is. Those laws enabled the population of enslaved persons to occur even after the banning of the slave trade in 1804, I believe it was. That's not the question. The question is, talk to me some more about the condition of free Black persons in the South during this period with respect to education. What I'll say is this: what we can appreciate, what we learn from this history, more than anything else, is that for Black people, they were willing to risk their freedom. They were willing to risk their lives to acquire education. Read the story of Harriet A. Jacobs, an enslaved African woman who, as a child, as a teenager, was able to acquire some measure of learning, who then would share that learning with other enslaved persons in a condition where they were never free from the threat of being caught. Yet there was always somebody interested in learning. That says to me so much about the courage of Black people during this period, whereas we have clearly indicated the laws were sound. No Black person, slave or free, were to be afforded an education.
The reason I was kind of driving that home because of the work we do. So I will tell you, we do get some pushback. I mean, I have visited colleges with my students who are predominantly Black and Latino, Latinx, depending on how you identify. I have had families walk out of the room to say, who are these people? I've had people say, do you know where you are? And I think in a country where we've put out that, education is the path forward.
Yes.
To understand that the United States government legislated, there were laws in place saying you will not have access to this.
That's right.
And so how much has been done to rectify, reparations is a hot topic, but just honestly, there was a concerted effort. I mean, with also the laws, I know it's off the side, the laws of prohibiting interracial marriage, was specifically to allow this separation. This is legislated.
That's
and
right.
So one of the things we also, because we're going to bring this on back home, but the thing is that America also loves a rebel. And loving the freedom, loving the revolution. And so I want to bring it back to Frederick Douglass. To your point, this is a man who totally was like, we're not following these laws, and was pivotal in securing this. So how do we even make sense? This is my question. How do we make sense of Douglass's achievements as a self-taught, formerly enslaved person? And what does he teach us today about education specifically?
Yes.
Or go where you want with it.
Douglass for me, as an educator, as a Black educator, as an educator of Black achievement in history, Douglass for me is a standard bearer. Here's someone who was able to literally fight his way out of slavery, make his way not just to the North, but eventually would make his way into Canada, made his way into England, toured different parts of these places to talk about the condition of Black folks who are still enslaved, used the education that he acquired. And mind you, we're not just talking about, you know, putting some words together. We're talking about somebody who, as I said, is arguably the greatest orator in the history of the United States. Who, you know, as legend would indicate, would get up in front of audiences and white people in the front row would faint at just his presence when he began to speak. He was such a commanding presence, such a anomaly, if you will, that white people couldn't even conceive a Black man with this level of learning, knowledge, and command, not just of the language, but the ability to speak in a manner to convince others against the very system that afforded them the privileges upon which they lived their lives. But here's the thing. Frederick Douglass, there's nothing unique or special about Douglass. Douglass wasn't born with some, you know, magic wand in his hand given by his parent. Douglass was merely someone who, when given the opportunity, was able to excel. Mm-hmm. And if we were to have changed the dynamic in the world at that time, thus affording education to all others on that plantation, on the various plantations throughout the South, we don't know. We cannot conceive the kind of world we would be living in right now in these United States. That's the point that needs to be appreciated and understood. It's not so much the fact that Douglass wasn't what was this exceptional Black person, and we have that here in our society today, do we not? This conception of these exceptional Black persons, and, you know, LeBron James, and, you know, so Serena Williams and Oprah Winfrey and whatnot, as though what those persons exemplify in their work is not something that every Black person has the potential and capacity to achieve. All it is about is opportunity. All it is about is access. And so when we hold that, when we hold the story of Douglass, that's the lesson I'm hoping folks will take away. That Douglass, as much as he is an exception of his time period, is by no stretch an exception in himself. The distinction is that when given the opportunity, he did no different than any other Black person would have done if they were in the same situation and state with the same level of support that he received.
I couldn't agree with you more. That is one of the reasons I love my job, that we are able to work with community college students, because I could see the shift even in language, going from saying we're working with high achieving students to high potential students, and how much the culture that surrounds education in someone's, so just literally the density of college educated people, that's going to have an impact. And so when I go to these schools, it's, you know, like one of the reasons the foundation focuses on community college is that 81% of all students that enter community college would like to have go on and have their 4-year degree. And 6 years later, you're looking at less than 10%. That's not adjusting for socioeconomic determinants. No. That's just for all students. So it's, again, a situation of there is but so much funding. People talk about defunding. Education to me has been defunded. But there is a willingness to put energy in punitive measures, in incarcerating people, in punishing them, and minimal investment. When we live, I think, in a society that is like, if you care about something, you invest in it. That's right. And so one of the things I also like you to go down the road with us is, could you talk a little bit more about how current legislation works to impede and undermine, quite frankly, Black educational attainment?
Oh yeah.
Achievement. Yes.
So I mean, there are many different avenues, of course, we could take to answer that question. But for the sake of our time, I'll just emphasize the point that was made in the presentation itself. Our public education system, more often than not, is determined by property. Those that own property, communities where people, you know, have mortgages and such, are the communities where you're going to find folks that have the better school systems. Neighborhoods where people rent, neighborhoods where there's public housing, et cetera, are going to be those areas where you're going to find the public education system lacking resources. Certainly, we can then add to that a layer of concern where you have whole cities that are working on budgets that cannot compete with the budgets of those communities just outside those cities in the suburbs. And so, when we look at, so what does all that say? All that says is that in the United States, our public education system is indeed determined by how much money you have in your bank account. The more money you have in your bank account, the better the likelihood is that your children are going to get a good education. I shared that those cases at the end of that presentation to really lift up that point. Yeah. That with respect to the same risk that Black folks had to take because of the legislation during slavery, we have African Americans as well as other people. I mean, we don't want to act like this is only occurring to Black folks.
Oh, very much so.
But that parents have to consider risking their freedom in order to assure that their children are going to get a decent education. That is not an indictment on the parent, but it is an indictment on the system itself. No different than during slavery, it was no indictment. No one in listening to this presentation today would look at Fred Douglass or Harriet Jacobs and wave the finger at them and say, bad on you to risk your freedom to get an education.
You broke the law and order.
Exactly. No. You deserve what you get. No. Yet we do that today. We do that very thing today with parents as opposed to wag the finger and, more importantly, get actively involved in changing the legislation that occurs that causes parents, that places parents in an impossible situation to have to then consider risking their freedom to see that their children get the best education possible to them. That is our United States of America. It needs to be changed.
I could not agree more. As someone whose parents, I'm a second generation college student, my parents funneled every dollar, mortgaged everything to the help for my brother and I to have opportunities. I was fortunate enough to go to good schools, but I hear you. And then one of the things I just want to add is just also ensuring that when students are allowed in the classroom, that they are not treated as props, that they are treated as peers, because I definitely remember sitting in U.S. history where people were just like these poor slave traders, like their inventory was decreasing. And I'm here like, excuse me, what? Or even better, when my teacher he showed us a section of Amistad where they threw all of the, all the slaves were committing suicide or going to the ocean. No warning, turned on the lights, only blessing. Rhoda, how did that make you feel? Oh. Not that I was there as a student to learn, but instead I was expected to emote on command. Yes. And that's when I realized, hey, wait a minute, I get questioned about whether or not I had the grades or the tests or the background to be in this classroom. And then when I'm here, I'm supposed to be here as a prop for, so I think, to your point, yes, there's the funding issues, but also for those that we're able to secure access for, it's just ensuring that their place is not seen as one, especially when we talked about, I loved your piece on the scandal, was it? Where, money was exchanged for positions, where legacy is probably taking up far more seats than any student. But I just wanted to kick it to Nancy. I see you over here. Feeling what we're feeling in this moment.
I am proud to say that I am a student of Ewario Allende. I have to say, every time, these presentations are something that I listen to intently, I watch multiple times, because as much as I have read and understand this, and for many of you who may not know, my research is on Frederick Douglass and his arguments. And so here I am taking notes, because even after watching it twice, because, all of these things, understanding them within today's perspective, everything that is happening today. And the fact that the Kaplan Educational Foundation exists, right? The fact that, Ewario, I know that you founded Origin as a way to kind of educate people on both social justice and race issues. I like to say we are happy that we are here, right? But isn't it something that this work has to be done? It has to be done intentionally, day in and day out. The fact is that the Kaplan Educational Foundation exists because there is a need. The fact is that you have created this organization in order to address an issue that is so close to us. I know as a woman of color, for me, especially in your presentation, I just have one question. It is, what would you suggest to organizations like ours, the Kaplan, Educational Foundation? You know what we do, but also these colleges, community colleges, the selectives, and to students themselves. I love the concept of, yes, Frederick Douglass was a very, very bright man who people fainted, right? But the reality is that our community is exceptional. We are an exceptional people that have fought, that have been, our learning has been outlawed, but yet here we are. And we are here on November 4th of 2020. Let it be known, right? So I'm here with you in heart and spirit, trying to push through this day. But I want to know from you, what do you have to teach us about what is it that we need to do to stand strong? Because yes, access is still needed in this country.
No, I think that first of all, the work of Kaplan Educational Foundation is not just critical, it is unique in that you provide a bridge to enable students who, not as a consequence of their lack of capacity to learn, not whatsoever, lack of access. Okay, whether that access is structural as a consequence of what zip code they were born into, or lack of opportunity with respect to an admissions process that, as we just discussed in the presentation, is kind of jaded from the jump, right? So on either account, we're dealing with, in the development of Kaplan Educational Foundation, an organization that provides a critical bridge for students into the four-year college experience, which, as we know, is the gateway to material development, financial opportunity, etc. The bridge that often, with respect to communities of color, whether they be African-American, whether they be Latinx, whether they be other immigrant communities, is a viable bridge to the development of generational wealth in this country. This is, so if I were to give a word to those institutions, I would say, Kaplan is your partner, number one. And secondly, those that, don't have the ability to immediately access the services of Kaplan Education Foundation, that there needs to be that connection.
Yes.
Four-year colleges need to be in conversation with community colleges.
Yes.
They need to understand what are the needs, what are the aspirations of the students, and then work with those college administrators to provide access. Because as your work clearly shows, we're not just talking about students who come onto the four-year campus and do okay. We're talking statistically students that excel. Students that absolutely blow it out the water.
More likely to complete than the traditional age freshman.
Absolutely. And so if there's any lesson I can take from history that supports the work, it's this lesson. It's this lesson that we're talking about here. That, as Douglass said, some people value education because they get it. Other people value education because they didn't get it. All right. And so we're dealing here. Your work is with a population of folks for whom education never came easy, right?
Never.
However they got it, right? We are assured of a few things. One of those things being that they are going to value it. And what kind of students does a four-year college want in their institution, other than students who come on that campus valuing the education they're about to receive?
Yes. I want to take that and package it and take it to every four-year institution, because I have to tell you, and I'm sure you know this, we would like to think that all the gates to education are open, but the reality is not. And to add to your point, one of the things that I have found is that when I walk into a four-year institution, I always point out that because in higher education, students are determined, like, what are the risk factors, right? The fact is that if you look at me and you say, this is, as a person of color, as a Latina, I am bringing down your numbers, right? Because the likelihood that I will complete from low income and all of that has to be addressed. I am an opportunity in the making. I am here and I can do some amazing things, right?
Yes.
Despite all of the challenges. And so I think we really have to hold on to that.
I just want to add one thing that you had said, Ewario, you had said about, I believe it was, the students, that might have been Nancy, not being served. I can tell you in this job, probably my toughest moments, especially, when you're working with students and bridging the 2-year to 4-year, mathematics is usually a pain area. We work to get our students to a minimum of free calculus. And I can tell you, my heart is broken the most when I had one of my students stand in front of me and talk about when she loved going to school in middle school, she loved doing math, and then she went to high school and she wept because she said she knew she had been failed.
Yeah.
She could not compete, not for lack of her intelligence. She had straight A's before, but simply was not challenged to meet her level of potential. That's one of the things that goes back, so it's for it to be that people were afraid of people being educated, and it was illegal, but so now it's more so if we just defund their education.
Yes.
If we lower their standards.
That's right.
Because I would say that's the number one thing. My students would be like, you're a tough cookie. I said, yes, because it does you no favors for me to sit here and pat you on the head and tell you pretty, tell you cute, tell you you're amazing. What you need is someone to give you realistic feedback and take you seriously.
That's right.
And so the other thing is they have not taken these students seriously.
Thank you.
But it is a new day.
Thank you.
And I will always and forever take students seriously, all students, because at the end of the day, this does come down to race and money.
Yes, indeed.
And that we cannot afford to have an undereducated population as we struggle to understand how germs are transferred. As we struggle to understand how do we keep people safe. As we have lost, I've had students, and I stand here and I do want to, my heart goes out to everyone who has lost everyone, whether it be through violence or whether it be through disease or whether it be through lack of care or negligence, that we take a moment today and in this moment and think about everyone is valuable. Everybody deserves a chance. And I would hope that, I'm going to kick it over to Nancy to close this out, but I would ask for anyone viewing this, for you to pause and think about the most vulnerable among us, and think about the Statue of Liberty, and think about what America is to stand for. And then to think about what are you doing to make sure that's the America we become, because I think it's quite clear as of today, as of history, as we look through this, that's not the America we are right now.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Rhoda, for bringing that home and for certainly really connecting all of the dots. I especially, I always want to honor anybody that walks into my life and teaches me to love myself more. I know that both you, Rhoda, and Ewario have done that. And I am grateful for you both and really grateful to have this opportunity. I want to encourage everyone to visit kaplanedfoundation.org. And I also want you to visit origin.org, and that is with a J. Is that correct, Ewario? Just want to make sure I got it correct.
That's correct in terms of the name of the organization. The website, for those that do want to get more information on our work, is racial-justice.org.
To the point. There you go.
Yes.
Yes.
And so this is important work. It's not going to be done by you just hoping that it is done. I want you and everyone here, including students, teachers, and anyone that is watching this, to know that a person of color, a student of color, regardless of age, regardless of income, is an opportunity for you to bring a voice that has been missing way too long in leadership. Yes, we are certainly hopeful that you will consider admissions for those students, but most importantly, I want you to know that the opportunity and your college will be strengthened by our presence. And that certainly, let me just put it out to you like this. This is not about doing a favor to people of color. We deserve spots in places. We have earned those spots in those places. And not only that, we will outdo so many people that you had the gate open to. So watch out. We are not going anywhere. We know we have an obligation to our ancestors to do this. And that's what we're going to continue to do. Whether people like it or not, here we are. So thank you. Please watch the series and make sure that you join us next week at the same time on Wednesdays at 3 p.m. for the third session of the Black Educational Experience in the U.S. with Ewario Allende and Rhoda Tamako. Thank you.
And Nancy Sanchez.